It is February 1558. In England, anticipation fills the air as the world's attention turns to two women whose strength has echoed through time. Mary I of England and Elizabeth I of England. Each carved her legacy across kingdoms, navigating betrayal, faith, and power in a realm where crowns were won not by birth alone, but by survival against all odds. Let us begin with the first, Mary I of England. Mary I of England was born on the 18th of February in the year 1516 at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, England. How did this child of two mighty dynasties, the Tudors and the Spanish Habsburgs, become England's first crowned queen regnant? What private scars did she carry from her parents' shattered marriage, her own loss of status, and the cruel loneliness of exile in her own land? Was she destined to be remembered in reverence or in fear? Please watch my full video until the end, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Please make sure to share it with your friends. Thank you. Now, let us dive into the full story. Mary was the only surviving child of King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Before her birth, Catherine had suffered several tragic miscarriages and stillbirths, and Mary's survival was celebrated as a miracle. 3 days after she was born, Mary was baptized at the Church of the Observant Friars in Greenwich. Her godparents included some of the most powerful figures in the kingdom: Lord Chancellor Thomas Wolsey, her great-aunt Catherine, Countess of Devon, and Agnes Howard, Duchess of Norfolk. From infancy, Mary was treated as a princess of importance. Her father delighted in her intelligence and beauty, and foreign ambassadors wrote admiringly of her bright presence at court. Yet beneath the polished ceremonies of royal life, the future held storms no one could yet predict. From the earliest days of her childhood, Mary was marked not only by her noble birth, but also by her precocious intellect and charm. At just 4 years old, she amazed a visiting French delegation by performing a musical piece on the virginals, a keyboard instrument similar to a small harpsichord. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, took a direct role in shaping Mary's education, drawing guidance from the Spanish scholar Juan Luis Vives. His treatise on the education of Christian women laid out a rigorous program of learning, and under this influence, Mary was taught Latin, French, Spanish, music, dance, and possibly even Greek, an uncommon achievement for a girl in the early 16th century. By the age of 9, Mary could read and write fluently in Latin, and her court tutors praised her sharp memory and graceful bearing. Henry VIII proudly boasted to the Venetian ambassador that his daughter never cried, and foreign visitors remarked on her fair skin, blue eyes, and red gold hair, traits inherited from both her English and Spanish lineage. Though still a child, Mary was already being considered for strategic marriages that could shape European politics. At just 2 years old, she was betrothed to the infant son of King Francis I of France. Later, at age 6, she was engaged to her much older cousin Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. While both arrangements were eventually broken, these early negotiations showed the weight of expectation placed on her shoulders, to be not just a daughter, but a dynastic key to England's future. As Mary entered her later childhood, her world expanded beyond the nursery and into the intricate web of court life and diplomatic ambition. At the age of 9, she was sent to the border of Wales and installed at Ludlow Castle to preside in name only over the Council of Wales and the Marches. Though she was never formally invested with the title, many around her began referring to her as the Princess of Wales, a powerful symbol of future authority in a kingdom still longing for a stable heir. While Mary's public role grew, so too did the pressure to secure a politically advantageous marriage. After her broken betrothals to the French Dauphin and Emperor Charles V, Her father's chief advisor, Cardinal Wolsey, renewed efforts to find her a suitor. Proposals poured in from across Europe. The French King Francis I expressed interest in marrying her himself, or arranging a match with his second son, Henry, Duke of Orleans. Other suggestions included her Scottish cousin, James V, King of Scotland, a union that would have dramatically altered British history. Despite these grand ambitions, none of the proposed marriages materialized. Political tides shifted rapidly, and Henry VIII's growing dissatisfaction with his lack of a male heir clouded Mary's position. Yet through these negotiations, she developed a keen awareness of her value in the eyes of powerful men, not as a future ruler in her own right, but as a pawn to be moved across the chessboard of European alliances. Behind the pageantry and etiquette of court life, young Mary was already learning the unforgiving rules of royal survival. As Mary grew older, the joyful pride that had once defined her father's affection began to fade. King Henry VIII, once delighted by his daughter's intelligence and composure, became increasingly bitter that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had failed to produce a male heir. By the time Mary was 9 years old, it was evident that no more children would come, and the king's hopes of a secure Tudor dynasty were left in limbo. His frustration began to shift from disappointment in fate to resentment toward Catherine, and eventually even Mary herself. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, Henry launched his campaign to annul his marriage to Catherine. The Pope's refusal to grant the annulment fueled the king's break with the Roman Catholic Church, and Catherine was cast aside, demoted to the title of Dowager Princess of Wales. For Mary, the consequences were deeply personal. She was declared illegitimate, stripped of her royal title, and forbidden to see her mother. Her household was disbanded, her attendants dismissed, and she was relocated to live under the care of her infant half-sister Elizabeth's household at Hatfield. Catherine, broken in spirit but steadfast in belief, never wavered in her love for Mary. But the forced separation left a lasting wound. Mary's physical health began to decline. She suffered from irregular illnesses and periods of depression, likely brought on by isolation and emotional trauma. Meanwhile, the girl once hailed as the hope of a nation found herself marginalized, powerless, and alone, a princess without a title and a daughter without a mother. The sorrow of both queen and child would echo through the rest of Mary's life. In the year 1533, everything changed for Mary. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer officially declared her parents' marriage void, and Henry VIII's union with Anne Boleyn was ruled lawful in the eyes of the New English Church. The once prized daughter of the king was now labeled illegitimate, and the crown she had once been raised to inherit slipped further from her grasp. Her royal title of princess was removed and replaced with the Lady Mary, a deliberate signal of her diminished status. Mary's new life was marked by humiliation and strict control. She was forced to live under the same roof as her baby half-sister, Elizabeth, the child of Anne Boleyn. Refusing to recognize Anne as queen or Elizabeth as a legitimate heir, Mary resisted the new order. Her steadfast refusal to submit to her father's demands only deepened his anger. The Countess of Salisbury, Mary's loyal governess, was dismissed, and the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapais became Mary's only trusted advisor. Isolated and ill, Mary was not even allowed to visit her mother, Catherine, who was dying in exile. When Catherine passed away in January 1536, Mary was inconsolable. Forbidden from attending the funeral, she mourned in seclusion. That same year, Anne Boleyn was arrested and executed, and Elizabeth, too, was declared illegitimate. But Mary's fortunes did not immediately improve. She remained sidelined, watched closely, and used as a bargaining chip in religious and political tensions. Once the pride of the Tudor court, Mary now lived under constant scrutiny, her future uncertain, her identity as a royal heir deeply scarred by betrayal, faith, and her father's relentless will. Though stripped of her title and denied her place in the succession, Mary refused to bend entirely to her father's demands. Her defiance became a quiet but stubborn act of rebellion. She would not acknowledge Anne Boleyn as queen, nor would she accept Elizabeth as a legitimate princess. Most provocatively, she continued to practice Roman Catholicism in secret, even as England officially turned Protestant. Her loyalty to her mother's faith became the core of her identity, a symbol of resistance against her father's new order. This determination came at a cost. Mary was not permitted to leave her assigned residence or attend court. She fell gravely ill more than once, with royal physicians attributing her ailments to stress, depression, and mistreatment. Even her relationship with her father disintegrated. For nearly 3 years, Henry and Mary did not speak. He threatened her with imprisonment unless she submitted completely to his authority. Under immense pressure and fearing for her survival, Mary finally signed a statement acknowledging her illegitimacy, accepting her father as supreme head of the Church of England, and renouncing papal authority, but privately she never accepted these terms in her heart. Despite her submission, Mary's standing remained fragile. She was readmitted to court, but always under close observation. Her life became a series of calculated appearances and silent sufferings. The political winds around her changed constantly, but her personal resolve never truly wavered. She endured humiliation and exile within her own homeland, but she never stopped believing that her royal blood, her mother's truth, and her God would one day restore her. The girl once raised to be queen now lived as a symbol of contradiction, defeated, yet unbroken. After years of strained silence and public disgrace, Mary cautiously returned to court, but the world she re-entered was no longer the one she had known. Her stepmother, Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, played a key role in smoothing Mary's return by urging reconciliation between father and daughter. Jane's kind demeanor, along with Henry's desire to show stability, allowed Mary to rejoin the royal household. Though still officially illegitimate, she regained some privileges and her own courtly staff, including her beloved lady-in-waiting, Susan Clarencia. Mary's life resumed within the splendor of the Tudor palaces, Greenwich, Richmond, Westminster, yet her role remained uncertain. The court had transformed into a parade of stepmothers and shifting alliances. Jane Seymour died giving birth to Edward, Henry's long-awaited male heir. Mary, despite her own reduced status, was made godmother to the infant prince and led the mourning at Jane's funeral, a sign that she was not entirely discarded. In the years that followed, Henry married 3 more times. Some queens, like Catherine Parr, worked to maintain family harmony and even brought Mary and Elizabeth closer into the fold. Yet each new marriage carried risks. Mary's political future remained in limbo, and she was still eyed with suspicion by Protestant advisors. Through it all, Mary learned to navigate the unstable world of court politics. She played her role with grace, observed with caution, and maintained her Catholic identity in a palace shaped by religious reform. Her path to redemption was slow and uncertain, but with each passing year, her place in the family and in the nation's memory was inching closer to restoration. When King Henry VIII died in the year 1547, his only son, Edward VI, ascended the throne at the age of 9. Though Mary was restored to the line of succession by the Act of Succession in 1544, she remained illegitimate in legal terms, and more importantly, she was now a devout Catholic woman in a kingdom ruled by Protestant regents. Edward's council, led by ambitious Protestant nobles, quickly moved to solidify religious reforms, enforcing the English Book of Common Prayer and outlawing Catholic Mass. Mary found herself increasingly isolated. Retreating to her inherited estates in Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex, she avoided court and quietly continued her traditional worship in private chapels. Her refusal to abandon the Mass became a national controversy. She appealed to her cousin, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, to pressure the English government on her behalf, even as officials attempted to suppress her religious practices. Relations between Mary and Edward grew tense. Their last significant meeting came during Christmas of 1550, when the teenage king publicly shamed his older sister for disobeying his laws, bringing both to tears in front of the royal court. Despite ongoing pressure and even suggestions that she be smuggled out of England for her safety, Mary held her ground. She would not yield her faith, even as friends and allies warned her of the growing danger. In the shadow of her brother's Protestant reign, Mary remained a symbol of Catholic resistance, not by violence or rebellion, but by her unshaken devotion and quiet strength. Though politically powerless, she was not forgotten, and when Edward's health began to fail, the question of succession would soon place her faith and her future at the center of a national crisis. In the summer of 1553, young King Edward VI lay dying, consumed by a lung disease. Fearing that his Catholic half-sister Mary would undo the Protestant reforms of his reign, Edward, influenced by his powerful advisor, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, altered the succession. Defying the Act of Succession, he named Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin and Northumberland's daughter-in-law, as his heir. On the 6th of July, Edward died. By the 10th, Lady Jane was proclaimed queen, but Mary was not so easily cast aside. Warned that her summons to London was likely a trap, she fled to East Anglia, a region where her estates and Catholic supporters offered protection. From Kenninghall in Norfolk, she issued letters to the Privy Council asserting her lawful right to the throne. Within days, loyal nobles, soldiers, and common people gathered to her cause. By the 12th of July, she had raised an armed force at Framlingham Castle, ready to challenge Jane's claim. The momentum shifted swiftly. Support for Northumberland collapsed, and London turned against him. On the 19th of July, Lady Jane was deposed after just 9 days. Mary entered London in triumph on the 3rd of August, greeted by cheering crowds, her half-sister Elizabeth by her side, and over 800 nobles and gentlemen in procession. Against great odds, Mary had claimed the throne not through bloodshed, but by the sheer force of legitimacy, loyalty, and the deep yearning of a divided nation for stability. Her reign as England's first true queen regnant had begun, not as a pawn or a consort, but as a sovereign in her own right. With the crown finally hers, Mary faced a kingdom filled with hope, anxiety, and fractured loyalties. As England's first undisputed queen regnant, a woman ruling in her own right, Mary entered uncharted political territory. On the 1st of October in the year 1553, she was crowned at Westminster Abbey by Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester. The ceremony followed traditional grandeur, but its symbolism carried deeper weight. For the first time in English history, a woman alone bore the scepter of state power. Almost immediately, Mary began reversing many of her brother's Protestant reforms. She ordered the release of imprisoned Catholic nobles, including the elderly Duke of Norfolk and Bishop Gardiner, who soon became her Lord Chancellor. Though she had triumphed over the usurpers, her Privy Council remained divided. Many of its members had supported Lady Jane Grey and now served under Mary out of convenience, not loyalty. Her legitimacy was fragile, her religious agenda controversial, and her court filled with watchers and whisperers. Yet Mary proved unexpectedly decisive. She restored the validity of her parents' marriage and abolished Edward's religious laws. But she also declared publicly that she would not force any of her subjects to follow her faith, a promise that would soon be tested. At age 37, Mary also faced the pressing question of succession. Without a husband or an heir, the next in line remained her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth. For Mary, securing the future of her Catholic restoration meant more than ruling, it meant producing a child. And so, her attention turned toward marriage and the most fateful decision of her reign. Mary's decision to marry was not just personal, it was political. To secure a Catholic heir and protect her religious reforms, she needed a husband. But her choice stunned the nation. Ignoring Parliament's plea to choose an English nobleman, Mary accepted the proposal of her cousin Philip, the son of Emperor Charles V and future King of Spain. Though Philip was a powerful ally and devout Catholic, he was also a foreign prince, and many in England feared that their queen was handing the kingdom to Spanish control. Anti-Spanish sentiment flared quickly. Protestants feared the arrival of the Inquisition, while English patriots feared the loss of independence. Rumors, pamphlets, and ballads flooded the streets, warning of foreign tyranny. France, threatened by an Anglo-Spanish alliance, began covert efforts to destabilize the situation. These tensions erupted into open revolt in early 1554, when Thomas Wyatt the Younger led an uprising from Kent, demanding that Mary abandon the marriage and place Elizabeth on the throne. The rebellion was crushed, but the consequences were grim. Lady Jane Grey and her husband were executed. Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower, suspected of complicity. The message was clear. Mary would not tolerate challenges to her reign or her choice of husband. On the 25th of July, 1554, Mary and Philip were married at Winchester Cathedral. The ceremony was elegant but uneasy. Philip spoke no English. Their court communicated in Spanish and Latin. Though a royal match had been made, the cost was high. Mary had won a king, but she had deepened the divide between her crown and her people, and between her own heart and the trust of the nation she ruled. In the months following her marriage to Philip, Mary believed she had achieved her greatest hope. She was pregnant. By late 1554, her body showed the familiar signs: swelling, morning sickness, and the absence of her monthly courses. Courtiers rejoiced, and Parliament passed a law naming Philip regent if Mary were to die in childbirth. The nation prepared for the birth of a long-awaited Catholic heir, and Mary herself glowed with joy and anticipation. But as the months passed, no child came. By the summer of 1555, Mary's physical symptoms began to fade. Her abdomen receded, her energy declined, and murmurs filled the court, not of celebration, but of doubt. Physicians grew silent, and even her closest attendants began to question whether there had ever been a pregnancy at all. Behind closed doors, Mary clung to hope, praying fervently for a miracle. But none came. When it became clear that there would be no baby, the dream crumbled. The people grew disillusioned, suspecting deception or divine judgment. The queen, once radiant with expectation, now sank into despair. Philip, sensing political instability and having no personal affection for Mary, left England to wage war in the Netherlands and did not return for more than a year. Mary's heart broke, her health declined, and her spirit darkened. The joy of impending motherhood had turned into national humiliation. Without an heir, her religious reforms stood on shaky ground, and her political influence waned. What was meant to be the dawn of a Catholic revival now seemed to many like a hollow promise, a monarchy built on illusion, not hope. Determined to restore Roman Catholicism in England, Mary launched a campaign to undo decades of religious change. With her husband Philip's support and Parliament's approval, she reinstated heresy laws and brought the Church of England back under the authority of Rome. At first, Mary promised tolerance, but by 1555, that promise faded. Those who defied her return to Catholic doctrine were no longer seen as dissenters, but as heretics. What followed became one of the darkest chapters of her reign. Over 280 people, many of them ordinary men and women, were burned at the stake for refusing to renounce Protestant beliefs. Bishops Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer became the most prominent victims. Cranmer, though he recanted and returned to the Catholic Church, was still executed. In a final act of defiance, he withdrew his recantation moments before the flames reached him. Public reaction to these executions was severe. Crowds wept or turned away. Even Philip's own advisors warned that the brutality was stirring dangerous resentment. But Mary pressed on. She saw herself not as a tyrant, but as a protector of souls, purging England of dangerous heresy. To her, the flames were not acts of cruelty, they were sacrifices made in service to eternal salvation. Yet outside courtly circles, the fires ignited outrage. Those who perished became martyrs in the eyes of the people. And Mary, once greeted with cheers at her coronation, now earned a new and lasting name whispered across England, Bloody Mary. Her dream of spiritual unity had become, in the eyes of many, a nightmare of fire and fear. While Mary focused on spiritual restoration, her reign was increasingly tested by external pressures and internal hardship. In 1556, her husband Philip was crowned King of Spain. Though Mary remained in England, Philip pushed her to support Spanish interests in a renewed war against France. Her advisors hesitated, fearing economic ruin and political backlash. But Mary, eager to stand by her husband and strengthen Catholic alliances, declared war in June 1557. At first, there was victory. English forces fought valiantly at the Battle of St. Quentin, but triumph was short-lived. In January 1558, the French captured Calais, England's last stronghold on the European mainland. The loss stung deeply. Calais had been held since the time of Edward III, and its fall was not just strategic, it was symbolic. According to legend, Mary said that when she died, the word Calais would be found engraved on her heart. Back home, things were no better. Years of poor harvests led to food shortages and famine. The cloth trade with Antwerp collapsed, shaking the English economy. Hopes that marriage to Philip would bring riches from Spain's New World Empire proved false. The Spanish jealously guarded their trade routes, and Mary, bound by loyalty, did not permit English piracy or smuggling. To improve revenue, her government revived earlier efforts for fiscal reform. She granted a royal charter to the Muscovy Company, encouraged overseas ventures, and oversaw the publication of a revised Book of Rates. But these efforts brought limited relief. The people were hungry, the treasury strained, and Mary's vision of a united Catholic England was slowly being overshadowed by a country weary of war, loss, and unanswered prayers. By the spring of 1558, Mary was in decline, weakened in body, isolated in politics, and wounded in spirit. Believing once more that she was pregnant, she named Philip regent should she die. But like before, no child came, and with it, the hope for a Catholic heir faded. Her health worsened, likely due to cancer or cysts. She withdrew from view, her legacy slipping from her grasp. Even Philip kept his distance, writing from Brussels with restrained words. I felt a reasonable regret for her death. On the 17th of November in the year 1558, Mary died at St. James's Palace during an influenza outbreak. She was 42. Cardinal Reginald Pole, her spiritual advisor, died the same day. She was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, not beside her mother, but in a shared tomb with her half-sister, Elizabeth I. The inscription read, "Here sleep Mary and Elizabeth, sisters, in hope of resurrection." Her reign lasted just over 5 years. To some, she is Bloody Mary, remembered for fires and fear. To others, she was a queen of fierce devotion, trying to restore her faith and her mother's honor. Her story still echoes through history. Let us now turn to another remarkable figure of royal descent. Elizabeth Tudor was born on the 7th of September in the year 1533 at Greenwich Palace, on the banks of the River Thames, near London. How did this girl, born amidst scandal and suspicion, rise to become one of England's most iconic monarchs? What secrets did she carry as the daughter of a queen executed by her own father? And what kind of courage was required to outlive disgrace, betrayal, and fear, only to shape the fate of a nation with wisdom and might? Elizabeth's birth was both a triumph and a disappointment. Her father, King Henry VIII, had broken away from the Roman Catholic Church and married Anne Boleyn in hopes of securing a male heir. But when Anne delivered a daughter instead of a son, royal celebration gave way to muted acceptance. Even as a baby, Elizabeth stood in the shadows of expectation. Yet she was a healthy, spirited child, red-haired and alert, traits her father admired. For the first 2 years of her life, Elizabeth enjoyed the privileges of a royal princess. She had her own household, servants, and nursery staff. Her mother, Queen Anne, doted on her and made sure she was educated even in infancy. But those early years of comfort were built on fragile ground. Whispers at court questioned Anne's influence, her faith, and her future. And for Elizabeth, destiny had already begun its winding path, a path where safety, loyalty, and even survival would become daily uncertainties. From the moment of her birth, Elizabeth's journey was bound to the unstable heart of Tudor power. After the execution of her mother Anne Boleyn in the year 1536, Elizabeth was stripped of her title as princess and declared illegitimate. Still, her father allowed her to remain part of the royal family's extended household. Though she lost her position in the line of succession, she retained a modest household and continued to live under royal watch, far from the center of power, but never truly forgotten. It was in this quieter world that Elizabeth's character began to take form. She lived in Hatfield and other country residences, where she was shielded from court intrigues, but not from intellectual challenge. Her education was overseen by some of the most distinguished tutors in England, including William Grindal and later Roger Ascham. Under their guidance, Elizabeth mastered Latin and Greek, studied French and Italian, and became well-versed in rhetoric, history, and classical philosophy. She read widely and wrote often, developing a sharp memory and a clear, commanding voice. Even as a girl, she displayed a deep sense of discipline and caution, understanding the fragile balance between silence and strategy. She knew how quickly favor could turn to ruin in the Tudor court, a lesson drawn from her mother's downfall and her own changed status. Her keen mind, quiet observation, and growing command of language set her apart. Unlike her half-siblings, Elizabeth was neither a declared heir nor completely removed from royal attention. She lived in the gray space between exclusion and destiny, educated not just for show, but in readiness for a role no one could yet name. In these formative years, the seeds of her future rule, steady, clever, and fiercely self-controlled, were carefully and quietly sown. Elizabeth's earliest years were shadowed by one of the most shocking events in Tudor history, the downfall of her mother, Anne Boleyn. Once the dazzling queen who had captivated Henry VIII and helped spark the English Reformation, Anne's position soon became dangerously unstable. After failing to produce a male heir and surrounded by whispers of betrayal, her enemies at court moved swiftly against her. In May of 1536, when Elizabeth was just 2 years old, Anne was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and high treason. Accusations many historians now believe were politically driven and false. Within weeks, she was tried, convicted, and executed at the Tower of London. Henry VIII barely mourned. He had the marriage declared invalid and removed Elizabeth from the line of succession. Though too young to remember the events directly, Elizabeth grew up knowing the weight of her mother's fate. Her royal status vanished almost overnight, and she was no longer referred to as princess, but merely Lady Elizabeth. Her household was reduced, and her care left in the hands of distant relatives and attendants who owed more loyalty to the king than to his discarded daughter. The story of Anne's swift rise and brutal fall became an unspoken warning, one Elizabeth never forgot. Court life was beautiful and deadly, and love could be as dangerous as treason. In later years, she avoided speaking of her mother, not from lack of feeling, but from the wisdom of caution. Even as a child, Elizabeth began to understand that survival in a royal family was not a matter of birth alone. It was a matter of endurance, silence, and strategy. Following Anne Boleyn's execution, Elizabeth's world changed drastically. No longer addressed as princess, she was reclassified by royal decree as illegitimate, a painful label for a child of just 2 years. Though still the daughter of a king, Elizabeth was now a royal outsider. Her household was stripped of many privileges, her attendants reassigned, and her place in courtly ceremony erased. She would now live in the long shadow of disgrace, bearing a title that reminded everyone she was no longer a rightful heir. Yet, despite this legal rejection, Elizabeth was not completely abandoned. Her stepmother, Queen Jane Seymour, treated her kindly, and her governesses, particularly Lady Margaret Bryan and later Catherine Champernowne, ensured that her emotional needs and education were not neglected. When Queen Jane gave birth to Prince Edward in 1537, Elizabeth was brought to court to greet her infant half-brother, reaffirming her delicate but lingering presence in royal life. Elizabeth learned to navigate her uncertain role with remarkable maturity. She grew polite, cautious, and observant. Her natural wit and sharpness impressed visiting diplomats, and even King Henry, who had once disowned her, occasionally showed moments of affection. Over time, he began to provide for her upkeep again, and by the early 1540s, Elizabeth was once more living in royal households, though not restored to the succession. In these formative years, Elizabeth developed her core instincts, restraint, resilience, and reason. Denied legitimacy and ignored by law, she began crafting her identity through intellect and discipline. She would not plead for recognition, she would earn it. And quietly, the girl once cast aside was learning to endure a court that had buried her mother, and might one day try to bury her too. When Mary ascended the throne in 1553, Elizabeth's life changed once again, this time with intense uncertainty. Although they were half-sisters, the bond between Mary and Elizabeth had always been uneasy. Mary was Catholic, devout, and traditional. Elizabeth, though outwardly compliant, had been raised in the intellectual circles of reformers and was quietly sympathetic to Protestant ideals. Their religious differences were not just private beliefs, they carried political weight in a kingdom divided by faith. At first, Mary treated Elizabeth with grace. She invited her to court, granted her honors, and included her in public events. Yet the warmth was thin and brittle. Many around the Queen viewed Elizabeth as a Protestant figurehead, a potential rallying point for rebels, and a threat to Catholic restoration. Elizabeth, aware of the danger, adopted a posture of strict obedience. She attended Mass, dressed modestly, and avoided any hint of dissent. But suspicion deepened following Wyatt's rebellion in early 1554. an uprising fueled by opposition to Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain. Though Elizabeth denied any involvement, she was arrested, questioned, and eventually imprisoned in the Tower of London. Her fate hung in the balance. The same walls that had once held her mother now echoed with the weight of her own possible execution. Though she was later released to house arrest, the experience left its mark. Elizabeth learned that silence could be survival, that appearances mattered more than truth, and that favor at court could shift in an instant. Under Mary's rule, Elizabeth's life became a careful performance, one of dutiful sister, loyal subject, and silent survivor, all while the eyes of a paranoid court watched her every step. In March of 1554, Elizabeth was taken to the Tower of London under heavy guard. She was 20 years old. The charge was treason, not by her own hand, but by alleged association with Wyatt's rebellion. The Tower, already infamous as the site of her mother's execution, became her prison. Rain fell as she entered through Traitor's Gate, a chilling reminder of how close she stood to death. Mary's advisors pushed for harsh measures, some even demanding Elizabeth's execution to eliminate any future threat. But without direct evidence, the case remained tenuous. For weeks, Elizabeth endured grueling interrogations. She denied all involvement and kept her answers cautious and consistent. Even in fear, she refused to implicate others or display panic. She relied on calm, clarity, and silence, weapons as sharp as any blade in courtly politics. Her time in the Tower stretched for over 2 months. She wrote to Mary, pleading her innocence while maintaining formal respect. Eventually, the pressure eased. Whether due to lack of evidence, foreign diplomatic concern, or Mary's own reluctance to execute her sister, Elizabeth was released from the Tower in May. Yet she was not free. She was transferred to house arrest at Woodstock, where surveillance continued and trust remained absent. Those months in the Tower shaped Elizabeth profoundly. The threat of death had been real. She had lived beneath the same roof where Anne Boleyn was beheaded, walked the same halls, heard the same whispers. But she had endured. She had learned not only how to survive Tudor politics, but how to remain still, observant, and intact, even when the walls themselves seemed to close in. Following her release from house arrest, Elizabeth entered a delicate chapter of survival through silence. Though free from the Tower, she remained under constant watch and suspicion. The court was divided. Some viewed her as a threat to Mary's fragile regime, while others saw her as a necessary backup in case the Queen failed to produce an heir. Elizabeth walked a narrow path, speaking carefully, appearing obedient, and never giving cause for alarm. When Mary announced her pregnancy in 1554, Elizabeth's position improved slightly. She was brought back to court to be present for the anticipated royal birth. But as the months passed and no child arrived, hope faded into disappointment. Once again, Elizabeth became a quiet fixture of uncertainty. She neither challenged nor embraced Mary's rule, she simply endured it with poised restraint. Her reappearance at court was calculated. She dressed modestly, avoided overt religious alignment, and showed public respect to the Queen. In private, she continued her studies and maintained a tight circle of trusted advisors. She neither plotted nor provoked. She knew that Mary's reign was growing unpopular, especially after the failed pregnancy and unpopular alliance with Philip of Spain. Elizabeth's survival depended on patience, not ambition. In time, Mary's health declined, and with no heir in sight, attention shifted quietly back to Elizabeth. Foreign diplomats began to report favorably on her intelligence and demeanor. She was no longer just the Queen's sister. She was now seen as a likely successor. But Elizabeth made no declarations. She had learned that to reach the crown, she must never be seen reaching for it. Silence was still her shield, and patience her most enduring weapon. By the late summer of 1558, Queen Mary's health was in rapid decline. Years of illness, phantom pregnancies, and political disappointments had left her frail and fatigued. The loss of Calais to the French, England's last possession on the continent, was a final blow to her hopes of restoring national strength and Catholic dominance. As her strength waned, the question of succession loomed larger than ever. Despite deep misgivings about Elizabeth's Protestant leanings, Mary had little choice. With no surviving heirs and pressure mounting from foreign and domestic advisors alike, she named Elizabeth as her successor. On the 17th of November 1558, Queen Mary died at St. James's Palace. The same day, Elizabeth was informed of her ascension while staying at Hatfield House. According to tradition, when told she was now queen, Elizabeth sank to her knees and quoted the Psalms, "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." Her measured reaction reflected both her reverence for divine will and her understanding of the monumental task ahead. England was divided, economically strained, and politically unstable. Many feared civil unrest or foreign interference. Yet others saw in Elizabeth a figure of renewal, intelligent, cautious, and unburdened by the failures of the recent past. The council moved quickly to proclaim her queen. Bells rang across London, and crowds gathered in the streets. The daughter, once branded illegitimate, now wore the crown. Her path to power had been long and treacherous, but the gamble had begun. Could this young woman lead a wounded nation into strength, or would the crown consume her as it had so many before? Elizabeth's accession to the throne marked a moment of both celebration and anxiety. At 25 years old, she was young, unmarried, and without direct military experience. The kingdom she inherited was fractured, torn between Catholic and Protestant loyalties, burdened by debt, and haunted by memories of persecution. Yet her arrival sparked hope. Crowds filled the streets of London to welcome their new queen, cheering a ruler they saw as a fresh beginning after years of turmoil. Her coronation on the 15th of January in the year 1559 was a carefully crafted event. Elizabeth rode through the city in a golden gown, smiling and waving to the people. Pageants along the route praised her learning, chastity, and mercy, themes she would continue to emphasize throughout her reign. The message was clear. A new era was beginning, one rooted in wisdom and balance. Inside Westminster Abbey, she was crowned by the Bishop of Carlisle, one of the few prelates willing to officiate under a queen whose religious sympathies leaned toward reform. The choice was symbolic, signaling a shift without provoking open rebellion. Elizabeth understood the power of image and the need to unify a divided realm. She surrounded herself with trusted advisors, most notably William Cecil, and began shaping her court as one of intellect, restraint, and diplomacy. But beneath the triumph lay deep uncertainty. Elizabeth knew that her legitimacy, safety, and policies would be tested at every turn. England had gambled on a woman once discarded by law and court alike. Now she sat on the throne with the eyes of Europe watching, and the heavy crown of Henry VIII upon her head. From the moment she took the throne, Elizabeth faced a defining challenge: how to restore religious stability in a nation exhausted by decades of spiritual upheaval. The reigns of her father, brother, and sister had swung England from Catholicism to radical Protestantism, and back again. Now, Elizabeth had to chart a path that would unify her people without igniting civil war or inviting foreign intervention. Her solution was cautious, deliberate, and pragmatic. In 1559, she introduced the Elizabethan religious settlement, a legislative package that included the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity. The first re-established the monarch as supreme governor of the Church of England, while the second mandated attendance at reformed services and reinstated the English Book of Common Prayer. These measures aimed to create a middle way, a Protestant doctrine with ceremonial elements familiar to Catholics. The approach was not without opposition. Puritans wanted deeper reform, while hardline Catholics rejected her authority entirely. Yet Elizabeth remained firm, insisting that she had no desire to make windows into men's souls. Her focus was national unity, not personal piety. She avoided the fiery rhetoric of her predecessors, preferring moderation over zeal. Bishops who refused the settlement were replaced, and sermons were monitored for inflammatory speech. Elizabeth's religious policy laid the foundation for what would become Anglicanism, a distinctly English faith tradition that balanced scripture, tradition, and national identity. Through careful language and strategic restraint, she quieted much of the unrest that had plagued the realm. It was not peace born of harmony, but of weary compromise, and in a fractured kingdom, that was its own form of triumph. As queen, Elizabeth's court was a place of spectacle, refinement, and tightly controlled charm. She surrounded herself with poets, musicians, scholars, and diplomats, all carefully curated to reflect the image of a wise and gracious monarch. Her own intelligence and wit were legendary, and courtiers vied for her favor with gallant flattery and elaborate entertainments. Yet beneath the pageantry, one question lingered constantly: would Elizabeth marry? Marriage for a queen regnant was not simply personal, it was political. Suitors came from across Europe: Philip of Spain, the Archduke Charles of Austria, and even the Duke of Anjou. Each match promised alliances, but also threats of foreign influence, religious complications, and the risk of childbirth, which in that era remained perilous. Elizabeth entertained their offers with diplomatic finesse, encouraging hope while never committing. She was a master of delay and ambiguity. Within England, Robert Dudley, her childhood friend and the charismatic master of the horse, became the center of romantic gossip. Though rumors of affection and even secret marriage swirled, Elizabeth never confirmed them. Dudley's presence at court endured, but so did his political baggage. His wife's mysterious death in 1560 raised suspicions, and Elizabeth, ever conscious of public opinion, kept her distance without severing the bond. By refusing to marry, Elizabeth maintained her independence and avoided entangling alliances. She crafted a powerful image as the Virgin Queen, married only to her kingdom. This choice, both practical and symbolic, gave her unmatched authority in a male-dominated world, a sovereign who answered to no husband, and whose hand, like her crown, could not be claimed. Despite her popularity, Elizabeth's reign was under constant threat, not from open warfare, but from whispers, plots, and shadows. Many Catholics across Europe viewed her as illegitimate and her throne as stolen. Within England, pockets of resistance smoldered, fueled by foreign influence and domestic discontent. At the center of many of these tensions stood a single name: Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. Mary, a Catholic cousin to Elizabeth, had once been Queen of France and now claimed a rightful place in the English succession. Her presence in England after fleeing rebellion in Scotland created a dangerous magnet for dissent. Catholic loyalists, papal agents, and foreign powers alike saw Mary as the true heir, a queen who could restore the old faith to the English crown. Several plots erupted during this period, including the Northern Rebellion in 1569, which attempted to place Mary on the throne. The Ridolfi plot followed, with Spanish support and the promise of invasion. Each time, Elizabeth's advisors, especially Francis Walsingham, tightened the web of intelligence gathering and counterespionage. Intercepted letters, coded messages, and informants became critical tools in a new kind of warfare, one of secrets and silence. Elizabeth remained deeply conflicted. She saw Mary as a threat, yet also as a fellow sovereign, a cousin, and a woman who had fallen from fortune. For nearly 2 decades, she kept Mary under house arrest, resisting calls for execution. But the danger never faded. Elizabeth ruled in a world where loyalty could shift with a letter, and where a distant cousin, cloaked in scandal and hope, could still ignite rebellion with her very name. As Elizabeth's reign matured, foreign conflict became unavoidable. While she had long favored cautious diplomacy, the tides of European power politics, combined with religious hostilities, eventually pulled England into open war, most famously against Spain. At the heart of it stood Philip II, King of Spain and former husband to Elizabeth's sister, Mary. He viewed Elizabeth's Protestant rule as both a religious offense and a political threat. Tensions had simmered for years. Elizabeth had covertly supported Protestant rebels in the Netherlands and allowed English privateers like Francis Drake to raid Spanish treasure ships. These actions, though unofficial, deeply angered Philip. When Elizabeth executed Mary Stuart in 1587, a Catholic queen with royal blood, it became the final provocation. In response, Philip launched an enormous naval force, the Spanish Armada. In the summer of 1588, the Armada set sail to invade England and restore Catholic rule. England, though outmatched in size, had faster ships, better maneuverability, and a well-coordinated strategy. The English Navy, supported by fierce weather in the English Channel, dealt heavy blows to the Spanish fleet. Elizabeth's speech to the troops at Tilbury became legendary. Dressed in armor, she declared, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Her words ignited patriotic fervor. The defeat of the Armada was not just a military triumph, it became a defining symbol of national identity. England had survived invasion, and Elizabeth emerged as a warrior queen in the eyes of her people. Though the war with Spain continued for years, the failed Armada marked a turning point, proof that Elizabeth's England could defy even the mightiest empire. In the later decades of her reign, Elizabeth crafted a powerful image, the Gloriana myth. She portrayed herself as the Virgin Queen, mother of the nation, and symbol of stability. Her likeness appeared on coins, portraits, and tapestries, all carefully designed to show divine beauty and unshakable rule. Portraits were tightly controlled. Artists needed approval, and the chosen images showed her in elaborate gowns, glowing white skin, and surrounded by symbols like globes and serpents, suggesting wisdom, power, and vigilance. These were more than art. They were calculated tools of propaganda. Writers like Edmund Spenser praised her in works such as The Fairy Queen, presenting her as a near-mythical figure. Royal progresses and court ceremonies emphasized her majesty while keeping her emotionally distant. She became a paradox, both revered and unreachable. Yet behind the image stood a ruler without an heir navigating threats and politics. By mastering symbolism, Elizabeth controlled not only her court but her nation's imagination. The Gloriana myth became her armor, lasting long after her reign. In her final years, Elizabeth faced deep loneliness and declining health. Trusted advisors had passed, and the court grew quieter. She resisted naming a successor, haunted by the uncertainty of what came next. In early 1603, she fell ill and refused to take to bed. She passed away at Richmond Palace on the 24th of March. Her 44-year reign shaped English identity, culture, and monarchy itself. She left behind no children but a legacy that birthed an era, the Elizabethan age. Few monarchs have ruled so long, and fewer still left so lasting an imprint on the soul of a nation. What do you think about Mary I of England? Was she a brave and determined queen, a woman who fought to reclaim her birthright and restore her faith with unwavering resolve? or a tragic ruler, remembered more for the flames of persecution than for the pain and isolation that haunted her crown? And what about Elizabeth I? Was she the visionary Gloriana, a monarch who shaped an empire through wisdom, resilience, and iconic leadership? Or a solitary figure, forever cloaked in myth, burdened by loneliness and defined by a legacy built on sacrifice? We would love to hear your reflections. Were these sisters rivals of history or reflections of one broken throne, each carrying part of its cost? Did their reigns shape a nation through fire and light, or were they bound by duty in a world that gave them power but little peace? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales from the past, stories of courage, choice, and the quiet force behind history. Thank you so much for watching.